In previous episodes, we talked about the sparsity of good dating evidence and the difficulty of setting out the timeline of the peopling of the North American continent. A recent Nature paper by Lorena Becerra-Valdivia and Tom Higham has addressed that lacuna using radiocarbon dating in conjunction with the archaeological record. I'm joined now by Dr. Lorena Becerra-Valdivia of Oxford University. So welcome, Lorena. Can you tell me how this particular research came about?
Yeah, so the aim of this, not only this paper, but my PhD thesis, was to try to establish or define a chronology for the peopling of the Americas, looking at that cultural, the human aspect timeline. We had looked at this question with my old supervisor, Tom, and we saw that there was a lack of a peopling model that could effectively sort of explain the available evidence. Clovis had gotten refuted in the 1990s, really, with the finding of Monteverde, which was an archaeological site in Chile, which was about 1,000 years older than Clovis, which is sort of this widespread complex in North America. In a way, it was a bit unfortunate because Clovis really answered every question associated with the dispersal, the who, the why, the when, the how, quite effectively. But it was no longer viable because the evidence didn't support it anymore. So with that in mind, and from our background, which was radiocarbon dating and chronology work, we wanted to tackle the question of the initial peopling of the Americas with chronology in mind, using the tools of radiocarbon dating and Bayesian modeling. And this was an application really that had been used by my supervisor, Tom Higham, before. This is a Nature paper from 2014, where he looked at the dynamics between Neanderthals and modern humans in Eurasia, looking at the archaeological and chronometric record. So it's taking a step back and using chronology to answer these large scale questions. So using that same sort of methodologies, I didn't come up with it, it wasn't novel, but applying that to the initial peopling of the Americas. So that was the big sort of overall aim of the project and the paper.
So drawing on Tom's previous work and your PhD dating, how have you gone about this?
Stepping back a bit and looking at the PhD, we're using radiocarbon dating and Bayesian edge modeling. In terms of the radiocarbon dating, I was able to analyze 18 archaeological sites found across the continent. Not all of them dated to the time period, not all of them yielded dates. So actually 3 of the sites that I managed to date in North America ended up in this paper. So what this paper is looking at, it's 42 archaeological sites from Beringian in North America. So integrating that previously published chronometric and archaeological information with the sites that I radiocarbon dated myself and looking at wide scale processes.
And how do you relate the dating to the cultural material?
So one of the things that we do in the paper is comparing, for example, the different and distinct cultural traditions. Within the 42 archaeological sites, there are sites that fall within one of 3 different cultural traditions. So we're sort of trying to look at the patterns and seeing which one came before, which one came later, if they're overlapping, and at what time these cultural traditions began. So that's where the Bayesian modeling comes in, because it allows us to integrate archaeological information with chronometric data to analyze these sort of larger patterns.
These are very well-known sites in the history of the research. So how did you handle these established case studies?
One of the sites that was included in this paper was the site of Anzick, which is the only known Clovis burial in North America. So it's quite an important site in First Americans research. And there had been a lot of controversy in Anzick with the dates that were from this. It was this individual, this male infant, that was found in association with Clovis artifacts, everything covered in ochre. Now, the dates for Anzick, individual Anzick 1 itself, had been quite variable. So there were some researchers in First Americans research that didn't actually think that this individual was Clovis. Okay, and there are important sort of implications there because the genome had been done and it was found that Anzick base order came before the split of the Native American branches, and it was actually more closely related to the southern Native American branch. So there was a lot of implications there in terms of Anzick, the individual being Clovis or not. So what we did, and this was sort of the aim of the project, was to produce accurate dates using the best radiocarbon methodology. So for the individual ANSIC 1, what we ended up doing is dating the sample using different methods, including single amino acid dating, which isolates hydroxyproline. So it's this really rigorous method that produces a very sort of contaminant-free date. And so through that, we were able to conclude that ANSIC was indeed Clovis. So that accurate dating was included in this paper. And that was sort of the goal, right? So we have a lot of chronometric data that's published, but we wanted to increase the resolution of the available evidence and sort of the accuracy and the precision as well of the dating that was done and included in the final project.
Now that you've combined the radiocarbon dating with the genetic material and the cultural material, what can you say now about the timeline that you couldn't say before?
Yeah, so based on our analysis, what we found is that we actually do see human presence in North America before, during, and after the last glacial maximum. So we do have the archaeological site of Chiquihuite Cave included, which is a paper that came out in the same issue of Nature. That's a site where you find human presence before an LGM layer. So you have about 200 lithic tools and different artifacts and debitage before an LGM layer. So we do have that site there. So that's sort of, it is one data point, but that's pinpointing on occupation or at least human presence before the last glacial maximum. So to recap, in the paper, we find evidence for human activity, human presence before, during, and after the last glacial maximum. But it seems that it wasn't until the Greenland Interstadial 1, and this is when we're sort of framing our results, it wasn't until Greenland Interstadial 1 that it's a period of abrupt global or northern hemisphere warming that we see the expansion of humans across the continent. And this is based on the sort of roughly coeval start of the 3 different cultural traditions happening at this time during the Greenland Interstadial 1. And now what's interesting about that as well is that then we frame that against last appearance dates for megafauna. And we see that the sort of commencement of these 3 distinct cultures is coinciding with 18 of the 24 last appearance dates that we have for North America.
I've got a feeling that was significant for the megafauna.
So in the paper, what we end up suggesting as well in terms of, megafauna and this question of sort of who did it, who caused the extinction, is that it is likely that humans did play a role, but it wasn't necessarily the arrival of humans, because we see that they're present in the landscape a lot earlier as probably low density groups, but there was rather during this period of expansion during the Greenland Interstadial 1 that likely sort of played a role in the demise of megafauna. So this is when we're sort of framing our results in this sort of bigger picture.
Forgive me for asking the obvious question, but what do we know now about the earliest sites in North America? And what was the pattern of population?
Yeah, in terms of, I get this question a lot in terms of patterns, for example. If we think of sort of where do we see people the earliest, for example, in North America, funny enough, we see them in the eastern side of North America. So I don't know if you're aware of the Solutrean hypothesis that says that humans first entered North America through the Atlantic. So this is one of the pieces of evidence that those researchers are using, is that actually, and interestingly, we do find the oldest sites in North America in the eastern part of the continent. And this could be because, perhaps in the Pacific, we do see that a lot of the evidence might be sort of underwater by now.
Is the Lutheran hypothesis very convincing?
So that's in terms of patterns, and we do mention it in the paper, but it is based on essentially, I believe, on 5 data points or so. So from our perspective, that's too small of a sample size to sort of say anything with any degree of confidence. But it is quite interesting, and I think it paints a more complex picture, really. And it does tell us that perhaps, with any sort of archaeological research question, that we haven't, all the evidence is we haven't found it yet. So it's quite interesting.
So is the discipline still struggling to establish the patterns of movement across the landscape?
What we can say, for example, in the paper, we do see that we don't really know the relationship, either the technological relationship and the genetic relationship between the different groups. So we don't know, for example, how the pre-Clovis groups relate really to Clovis or later groups or Clovis coeval groups. So in terms of sort of patterns, we don't really know what's happening because there isn't a lot of evidence. So technologically, even pre-Clovis sites, they're quite distinct and different. So there haven't been a lot of connections made between different sites. One of the sites that's different is the site in Texas, which the archaeologists claim that they sort of see this technological progression between pre-Clovis technology and then later Clovis age technology. But there's sort of a missing link technologically between all these different groups. And I think that sort of limits the conclusions that we can make in terms of how people were moving across the landscape, because it's really not until the time of Clovis that we see sort of these large-scale technological cultural traditions being diffused and shared and taking place across the landscape. So we don't really know much because we don't have those connections in terms of technology or genetics. So we're not able to say how many different groups there were and how they relate to each other.
What genetic information is there?
So in North America, the only archaeological sites that have genetic information are Ansic, which is this Clovis burial that I told you that has a genome, and then Paisley Caves, which has coprolites, so human coprolites. And Paisley Caves is this also a pre-Clovis site. Apart from those two, we don't have more genetic information. So it's really hard for us to sort of make any more conclusions about what's really happening, how many different groups and how they connected with each other and what was the relationship between the different groups, because the evidence is just not there yet.
And in terms of your role in this, how do you want to develop the evidence in the future? Where do you want to go from here?
What we hope to have done here with this work and with this paper is to create a timeline that can be built on. So it's based on radiocarbon information, archaeological information that's always sort of being updated and more data is coming out. And there are models that need to be tested, of course, with more data that comes out, and the resolution needs to be increased. So our idea with this is that the modeling that we have done can continue to grow and more archaeological sites added, and the chronology that we've created can become more and more robust as the resolution is increased. What we did as well for this is that, we created a timeline that hopefully can form a basis with which to sort of unpack biological and cultural evidence. We think, we're a bit biased coming from a radiocarbon lab, but we think that when you're looking at especially big questions like this, you need to define the when to sort of unpack everything else. So we think chronology is quite basic and it forms a foundation for research.
That requires others to produce the genetic information.
And in terms of sort of what I see that needs to be done in the future, one of the big things is what we already touched upon. I think there needs to be a lot more sort of genetic information to come out of North America and Beringia for us to start understanding and connecting or making connections, if there are any, between the different groups so that we can better understand the picture. So one of the things is this tool of sort of sediment DNA, which is finding human DNA within the sediments, which is used quite a lot for Neanderthal and Denisovan sites in Eurasia. And I know it's sort of being used now in North America as well. That would be key and very sort of important archaeological sites, pre-Clovis sites, for us to try to go out there and find more genetic information. That would, I think, help us feel the picture a bit more.
So what other information do you need?
The other thing in this paper, we're connecting our human timeline, let's say, with last appearance dates for megafauna. And last appearance dates are quite useful, but they don't really tell you the complete picture. If anything, what would be more sort of appropriate would be to look at the beginning of the demise for different species. So the other thing would be to create a formal timeline like we have done with megafauna, getting more dating and creating sort of a formalized statistical timeline that can then be formally sort of integrated with ours and looking at the different species and looking at different species histories.
What are the prospects of expanding this approach geographically?
The picture is not complete without looking at South America. Now, the reason that we focus North America and Beringia is because there's a lot more information and evidence in this part of the American continent, if you look at it as a whole, like we do in Latin America. In South America, the evidence is a lot more limited, partly because of funding issues. So a lot of archaeological sites are usually dated by 1 or 2 dates. And 1 or 2 dates don't allow us to really assess the chronology of an archaeological site. It's hard to make models like this with 1 or 2 dates. And so I think there needs to be increased work in South America, which there are amazing people working there and doing great work. But it's such an important continent. It was the continent that, because of Monteverde, it broke this Clovis-first barrier. So it's quite an important continent. And because of interhemispheric differences in terms of climate, for example, I think it needs to be looked at independently for us to assess the peopling pattern on South America. And then we can really compare that with North America and start filling out the gaps that we have in our understanding.
And what's your personal timeline for expanding this work?
I guess one of the joys of sort of being a radiocarbon dating specialist is that we get to sort of jump around different fields, different time periods, and different areas. I am no longer working in First Americans field. I have switched. I'm working human environmental relationships in Amazonia, but during the Holocene. So domestication of different like cultivations and stuff like that. So I've moved to a younger time frame, no longer sort of dealing with First Americans research, but I'm still very interested in this project and this research. I hope that in the future I might perhaps put in a grant of my own to keep looking at this topic.
I hope so too. Thank you for joining me today, Lorena Becerra-Valdivia.